Well, good morning or good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the current impacts of historical trauma. My name is Veronica Willeto DeCrane. I'm Dana. I live in Billings, Montana, and that's where I'm joining you all from. And I'm originally from my homelands in New Mexico, and that's where I grew up and have been living in Billings for quite a while now with my family, my husband and my 6 children. So excited to be joining you guys today. I'm with the National Native Children's Trauma Center. I'm a trainer and technical assistance provider in trauma-informed care, and I've been with the Trauma Center for several years now. Excited to be working with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute to bring you TTA through the Tribal Youth Resource Center. So we are here to discuss historical trauma, and just happy to be to have all of you guys joining us. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to my co-facilitator, and she will go ahead and introduce herself as well.
Thanks, Veronica. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. My name is Marilyn Zimmerman. I'm a citizen of the Nakota and Dakota Nations, and we reside on the Fort Peck Assiniboine and Sioux Reservation that's on the northeast corner of Montana. I do not live there. I live in Missoula, Montana, where I currently serve as the Senior Director of Policy and Programs at the National Native Children's Trauma Center here at the University of Montana. I'm the mother of 4 adult children. Nothing makes you feel older than telling the ages of your adult children rather than saying your own age. And the grandmother of 4 teenage grandchildren, and 1 is already in college. I'm really delighted to be here with you all today, and I hope this training is meaningful to you and your work. Thank you.
All right, so I wanted to share a little bit about our center, the National Native Children's Trauma Center. We are based at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana. So we do have staff that are there in Missoula, like Marilyn, and then there are some of us that live in places across the nation, like myself. And so we have been a trauma center for quite some time. I believe we started in 2003, if that's correct, Marilyn. And we started out providing direct services here in Montana, providing trauma treatment to youth in schools. And so from that, we we then took on this journey of becoming a training and technical assistance center. So we work with tribes across the nation, and through several grants, including we're funded as well through SAMHSA, as well as the OJJDP. So we're really we really care about the work that we do with communities, and we really want to work alongside communities to support you in your efforts to bring healing, to build the resiliency of the youth that you serve. So we're excited today that we get to speak with you, and hopefully this will be an interactive event where you can ask questions, you can interrupt us and let us know your thoughts and feedback on the contents, but we will be focusing on just different types of impacts that historical trauma has. And we'll go through the different ways in which communities are impacted, families and individuals are impacted, and then we'll be talking about ways in which we can address those impacts. So we're excited to have all of you guys here. Next slide, please. So we're just going to pause a moment and allow you guys to read the message on the screen. All right. So we want to start off with this question because I think it's on everyone's mind. If you haven't heard about historical trauma before, you're wondering maybe why we're having a webinar about it. But if you've heard about historical trauma, maybe it's something that you have gained some knowledge in and are working to address in your profession. And so we all come from different backgrounds and different experiences. And so we might be asking ourselves, why are we talking about historical trauma today? And so the reason that we address this at our center is because we see and we have found, and research has supported this, is that there's a lot of pressing issues in Indian country and tribal communities can be attributed to historical trauma. So the root, we often talk about this, the root of current and contemporary traumas that tribal people face and tribal youth experience is linked to and connected to these historical traumatic events that Indigenous peoples have experienced. And so that is why we feel like it's important to address. And sometimes in our communities, we may have some discussions around this about whether or not it's appropriate for us to talk about these historical traumatic events. There's concerns around spending too much of our thoughts around focused on some of these really devastating things that have happened in our communities. And so we acknowledge that and we want to be respectful of that. But we also want to make sure that we are armed with information that might be helpful in bringing healing and helping individuals in our communities understand what has happened. And hopefully with that understanding, you will feel more equipped to address some of these impacts that we'll be talking about today. And of course, with all of our presentations, anytime that we talk about trauma, we definitely want people to walk away knowing that healing is possible. So including historical trauma, healing from historical trauma is possible, and ways in which we can do that. And communities are already working towards that and are already experiencing this healing. And so we just want to make sure that that message is made clear, because sometimes when we talk about this topic, it can feel overwhelming. We can talk about some of these events and they feel very large and looming in our communities. And so we just want to make sure that we bring that message of hope that healing is possible. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we are helping professionals who are working with our youth, that they have the right tools. And one of those tools is actually having a historical trauma lens that allows us to ask maybe even a better question. We call it the right question, but sometimes it can just be a better question than what we've been asking. Sometimes we see things that are going on in our communities and we just wonder why. We wonder why so many social ills are occurring in our communities, and we're wondering why some of our people are struggling in the ways that they are, and that it can feel like there's just a lot of that, a lot of those struggles happening in a lot of families and with a lot of individuals. And so hopefully this webinar helps us to ask a better question that can help us address some of those things. And I feel like we are able to come from a more strength-based and resiliency perspective. And so we are able to actually look at our communities and our people and with understanding and empathy, and are able to provide support in the ways that are needed. So we just wanted to start off with that question. Why do we need to talk about this? And hopefully that makes it clear for you guys. If you want to put in the chat any reasons that you find that are helpful in talking about the current impacts of historical trauma. We would love to hear feedback from you, and why you feel like this topic is important to the work that you do. So feel free to share that in the chat. We would love to hear your feedback.
Next slide, please.
All right. So if you're writing in the chat, feel free to continue to do that. And we'll go ahead and move on and talk about what historical trauma is. So some of you might be new to this topic, or maybe you're just a little bit confused about what exactly we are talking about when we are talking about historical trauma. So often in our tribal communities and just in our society in general, we often talk about historical trauma as something that is political and something that is psychological. There's definitely some research behind it, and it's definitely a tribal community concept. So I tend to let folks know that, tribal communities, tribal peoples are the ones that really took this term and as a way to understand what was happening in our communities. And as you can see on the screen, one of the researchers, trailblazers in this area for tribes is Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. So historical trauma was a concept that was brought up before Maria conducted her research in term as it relates to tribal peoples. Other communities that had been impacted by historical trauma had been researching this this concept, such as the around the Jewish Holocaust. There is a lot of research that has been done that discusses the impacts of that Holocaust on generations. And so Maria, thankful for her work that she's doing and continues to do at the University of New Mexico, she actually offers us this definition, which describes historical trauma as the cumulative psychological wounding across generations, including the individual lifespan, which emanates from massive group trauma. So there are several ways in which we can describe historical trauma. As I mentioned, it's something that is political, so we'll talk about this in more detail, but there's definitely some policies that really impacted tribal peoples and were some of the root causes of some of the historical traumatic events that Indigenous peoples faced. I also mentioned that it's psychological, so we'll describe as Maria talks about just how it was a psychological wounding. Others have called it a soul wound. But this wounding, just impact that it has had at a psychological and deep spiritual level on many individuals, has been one of the impacts. It's also been talked about as something that is cumulative. So when we talk about cumulative trauma, we can often describe it as, it's just not just a single event that occurred, but oftentimes an event happened that was very traumatic, an experience occurred, and then on top of that, there were other experiences that continued to happen. So before any healing could be done or any recovery could occur, that there was just other events and other experiences that continue to build and accumulate, causing an impact on a person's a life across their whole life, as well as just causing what we call a collective trauma. So it wasn't just an individual that experienced this or It was actually something that entire communities and tribal nations went through. So this is what we are pulling out from Maria's definition of historical trauma. But it really is attributed to colonization. So one of the um, parts of this definition is really the idea that there's genocide and ethnocide that was the um, intent of historical trauma. So next slide, please. So a lot of times people interchange historical trauma with intergenerational trauma, because that is one of the aspects of historical trauma, is that there are intergenerational impacts. There's generational impacts. New generations continue to be impacted by these historical traumatic events. So that is why they're often used interchangeably. But as Walters and his research team have tried to describe, is that the difference between intergenerational trauma that other folks experience, not just tribal peoples or Jewish people, um, is is that there's a difference between intergenerational and historical trauma. So with historical trauma, there's that genocidal and ethnocidal intent that was there and that existed, versus with intergenerational trauma, one family, let's say that they have a generation in their family that has struggled with addiction, and so the cause of that addiction maybe in previous generations isn't linked to historical trauma, versus for some tribal families that addiction is rooted or is linked to historical trauma. So that is something that it's not that great of a difference, but definitely in our definition of historical trauma, we need to keep in consideration the fact that there was genocidal and ethnocidal intent. So next slide, please. And what we mean by that, hopefully, here's where the political aspect comes from, is a lot of the historical traumatic events that tribal peoples have experienced actually comes from some federal Indian policy. So we know through the history of colonization and how there was a lot of efforts to eradicate or eliminate the cultures and entire people groups in order for new settlers to live on this land that we now live on. And so a lot of that was happening as a result of just efforts to want land and want some of the resources that tribal peoples had access to. A lot of it was just the idea that if we can get rid of tribal people's cultures, that they would not be in conflict with the new culture that was being set up here in the United States. And so there's this effort to assimilate and force assimilation on tribal peoples. So a lot of that, that is where that ethnocidal and genocidal intent comes from, is just these federal Indian policies that were really meant to remove people and get rid of people who were in the way of the nation that was being built at the time, and also to seeing the cultures of tribal peoples as the problem, as the issue, and so trying to get rid of that culture. And so a lot of the policies, a lot of the historical traumatic events came from these policies that were sanctioned by the federal government. Next slide, please. So instead of going through each of those policy eras, which I encourage you to look for some resources and do your own research around that, I just want to point out what we feel is like one of the overarching themes that I've mentioned already before, which is this theme of removal. And so there's a quote here from General Richard Henry Pratt, and it's a famous quote. Some of us have heard it before, have heard it often, and it had to do with the policy of Indian boarding schools and the removal of children, forcing the removal of Indian children from their homes and their families and their communities, and placing them in these federally run schools that were actually not very educational or nourishing as we think of schools today. They were actually very detrimental to those children. And so one of the intent behind these schools that we have found comes from this quote of General Pratt, which is that a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So that was really the intent behind these boarding schools, was that ethnocidal intent of wanting to train Indian children to become American citizens in the sense that General Pratt and others believed what it meant to be an American citizen, what it meant to be a human being. And so that meant to them that they had to remove and eliminate and kill anything that tied those Indian children to their culture and to their identity, in order to assimilate them into the broader American culture. So this theme of removal was brought about through that policy. It was also seen in just the removal of tribal peoples from land. So as tribal peoples, we have a deep, deep connection to land and a relationship to land. It's the basis of our economy. It's the basis of our spirituality. It's the basis of our culture and our identity, that relationship that we have to land. And so that was one of the efforts, was to remove Indian people from that land. And that really was very detrimental to entire tribal nations who were forced, a lot of times they were forced by gunpoint to remove them from the land that they knew and that they were living on and that they were dependent on, and causing that rift was one of the efforts that was made as a result of a federal policy. And another type of removal, which I think Marilyn could speak to a lot better than I could, is really this theme of removal is not something that is only in our past. We continue to see the removal of Indian people. One of the ways in which we see that happening is through child welfare. So we see that there's just an overrepresentation of Indian children in the child welfare system that are being removed from their families, from their communities, and being taken away in that sense. We also see an overrepresentation of Indian children in the juvenile justice system and removing them from their communities and from their families in that same sense, through that system as well. So that theme of removal is not something that is just in the past. It continues to occur in these different ways. And I really appreciate the chat. There's some folks that are sharing their thoughts. We have Joy, who said, I think you said it, there are so many challenges in our communities that can be attributed to historical trauma. If we aren't thinking about that, then we are not addressing the core of many of our challenges. Thank you for saying that, Joy. I appreciate that. And Heather shared, I currently work in Indian education. Mental health issues are a huge barrier for kids getting to school. I'm interested in ideas to help the families we serve move toward healing. Absolutely. I think this approach will help strengthen our community and have a huge impact on our societal issues. Absolutely. We talked about the impact that historical trauma, the psychological impacts, and that's definitely one of the areas that we are seeing today in our tribal communities is just that need for mental health support and services. Absolutely. Well, thank you for addressing that area, Heather. So continue to add your comments in the chats and your responses to this content. We love hearing from you guys. So next slide, please. So as I've already mentioned, historical trauma sometimes we might mistaken it because of the name, the use of the term historical. We might think of it as events that happened a long time ago that really have nothing to do with our current situation or our current reality. But we actually are seeing and are finding that it's something that began long ago, but it's persisting today. Some of these historical traumatic events continue to persist, and they're not just things that are that happened in the past and are no longer relevant. So that is something that we want to bring out in this webinar is just the current impacts of historical trauma on tribal peoples and children. Next slide. So we're going to go ahead and just talk about it in these different ways, and hopefully it makes sense to you all, the way that we're going to organize the impacts. We're just going to start off by talking about some of the community level impacts and then the family level and then the individual level. Dr. Teresa Evans Campbell did a really great job in summarizing all of these impacts in her 2008 article, and she describes some of the individual impacts as being weak ethnic identity, substance use, historical loss reminders, some of the family impacts being severed family roles, loss of cultural parenting and practices, and then just the many community level impacts, the lateral violence, loss of sovereignty, severed community roles, unhelpful federal policies, poor economic conditions. So we'll just describe these in more detail in the slides to come. So next slide. So starting with the community level or level impacts, I think it's helpful to understand how historical trauma continues to persist today and has an impact on our lives today. And so in the right column, you'll see there's a list of current impacts, and these conditions didn't just come about out of nowhere. They're actually linked to some of the historical events that are listed on the left in the left column. So for example, in many, not all reservations, but many reservations, we actually find that there's a struggle with poor economic conditions. And so that can be linked to that establishment of reservations and how tribal peoples were forced to move to these reservations, and not just the fact that these reservations were poor. Oftentimes they were like the worst areas to move to, and places where it's very difficult to produce crops and other things like that. They were actually the land that was least desired by settlers, but there's also a lot of policies that were impacting these reservations that have led to the systemic systemic poor economic conditions that we see that continue to exist on these reservations today. We also have found that there is some health disparities, and so we'll talk a little bit more about how that individually impacts tribal peoples, but when we're talking about at a community level, we're seeing just how all of those statistics that we often hear about when it comes to our tribal peoples about issues with diabetes and heart disease and different type of cancers, and how there's just a greater number of our people that are dealing with those health disparities compared to the rest of the population. And so a lot of that stems from just those poor conditions that tribal families are living in, and even stemming from just the lack of resources and services that are existing in their communities. A lot of the treaties that were established and that were signed, that tribal nations signed with the federal government, were actually meant to ensure that tribal peoples had good health care, they had a good education system. Instead, a lot of those treaties were broken and never honored. And so what we find now is that there's just an underfunding of these service systems across Indian country that has historically been underfunded and continues to be underfunded today, causing a lot of these health disparities. So there's just a lot of linkages between current impacts that we're seeing, current issues in our communities that we're seeing, and how they're tied to these historical traumatic events. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move on to the family level. And I think this study is a really good one that really demonstrates the impact that historical trauma has had on families. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart conducted a study on the impact that boarding schools have had on Lakota families, and found that there was a link between how these children were treated in boarding schools, the fact that they were abused sexually, emotionally, verbally abused, physically abused. They were also neglected. They were also forced to do, a lot of manual labor, and were not allowed to really get a good quality education. They also were not allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to practice their spiritual practices, and they really kind of just were forced to view a lot of those spiritual practices and their culture as less than, or something that was just outright wrong, or just demonizing those practices. And so as a result of that, these children, because they've dealt with all of this trauma, when they then became parents, it was a real struggle for them. They didn't have good parenting modeled for them. They didn't get to grow up in a very healthy family, which they did come from very healthy families and communities in their tribal communities. And so they were taken from that, and in boarding schools didn't experience that. A lot of the abuse and physical abuse that they experienced then led to their parenting involving, very authoritarian discipline, just being insensitive to their children's needs, having a hard time bonding with their children, and not really having the spiritual foundation or the ethnic identity to really help them pass those on to their children, or just help them with that role of being a parent. And so a lot of this continues to be a cycle in our families, and has been something that we have been trying to address and and heal from. But these are some of the consequences that were found as a result of the boarding school, the harm that was caused at these boarding schools. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move to the individual level, and a lot of times it's very easy for people to kind of see like the connection between these historical events and the current conditions that are within our communities, like the poverty levels and the health disparities. People can see the linkages very easily. But when it comes to like the individual impacts, I think it's been very difficult for researchers to distinguish between those current conditions that individuals are living in and how it's having a psychological impact versus how that's tied to those historical traumatic events. And so Whitbeck and his research team tried to address this and investigate this a little bit more. And they found that there is evidence that adults and adolescents are having these thoughts of historical losses, and that these historical losses are causing some psychological effects. And so we'll take a better look at this study in the next couple of slides. Next slide. So let's start off with this chart, and there's a lot there on this chart, but I just want to help us kind of walk through it a little bit. So Dr. Les Whitbeck created this study, the Historical Trauma and Loss Study. They actually interviewed elders and adolescents and asked them about loss, historical loss. They asked them how many times, per day, per week, per month, did they think about what Indigenous peoples have lost as a result of historical trauma and colonization. And so these are their responses to that study, the elders and the adolescents, and how they responded to that study. And so I just want to help us out here a little bit, because there's a lot of columns there. And what I found helpful was just thinking about, how often these adolescents and elders thought about historical losses, and how even just thinking about it weekly seemed like a lot. To me, it seemed like a lot for them to think about these losses on a weekly basis. But when you actually combine the results from the weekly column with the daily or even the several times a day column, you actually start to see how significant these thoughts of historical losses are. So for example, the highest percentage that I found was actually the loss of our people through early death. So if you go down the list, you can see how there's the loss of our people through early death. And when you combine the weekly and the daily and the several times a day columns, we actually have found that 65% of the respondents have thought about these losses and how they caused an early death to their people at least weekly. And then the other one that was equally high was the loss of respect by our children and grandchildren for elders. So when I combined the weekly, daily, and the several times a day columns, that actually came to 65% as well. 65% of the respondents thought about how historical trauma resulted in the loss of respect of our children and grandchildren for elders. And then a close runner-up was thinking about the losses from the effects of alcoholism on our people, which actually turned into 63.5% of the respondents thought about this at least weekly or more. So I feel like that is really impactful, because that's the majority of our population that, if we think about this in terms of our general tribal population, that actually is really significant, that over half of the population has thought about these historical losses as a result of historical trauma. Next slide, please. So in addition to this, Whitbeck and his team, they also created the historical loss associated symptoms scale. And this scale was actually meant to measure how often the respondents had emotional responses to these thoughts of historical losses. So it's one thing to think about these historical losses. It's another thing to actually identify that they have had an emotional impact on individuals. And so they had 143 respondents who were parents and caregivers. They were between the ages of 28 and 59, and they had children that were between the ages of 10 and 12. So I actually relate to this population. And so I actually have a 12-year-old myself. And so these are adults around my age that are parents. And so they responded to this research study, and what they found is listed on this chart here. And so just to help us out a little bit more again, I wanted to kind of think about, when you feel sad or when you feel angry as a result of thinking about historical losses, if you're always feeling that way, or if you're often feeling that way, or even if you're just sometimes feeling that way, I feel like that's a big deal, especially when you're thinking about historical losses, the loss of land, the loss of language, the loss of culture, the loss of your people from an early death. You're thinking about that, and it's making you sad and depressed. It's making you angry. And then on top of that, you have other things happening, other stressors in your life that are occurring. So this can actually really weigh on people and really have an impact on people. And so when I combine the columns of sometimes, often, and always, I found that anger was one of the emotional responses, the highest emotional response that respondents had to thinking about these historical losses. And then a close second to that was the sadness and depression. And the third one, the third highest that I was able to identify was that it actually made people uncomfortable around white people. So I think those are some pretty significant emotional responses. Even if you are just sometimes having that emotional response, I feel like that can have an impact on an individual when you think about all of the other stressors that tribal peoples face in their daily life. Next slide, please. So there's more research that has been done on this idea of thinking about historical losses. Although there's some limitations, we can't really say that this is true for all Native people because of just the small sample in these studies. But what we are finding is that in these studies, there's not really been a difference between respondents that are under 30 years old or that are over 30 years old. So there's not really a difference in their scores. So whether they're younger or they're older, they're elders, they are thinking about these losses at the same rate, and they are also having those emotional responses at the same rate. We did also identify another trend, which is that those individuals who are struggling with substance use, substance dependence, they actually have been found to think about these historical losses a lot more often than others have. So I think that tells us a lot about how, even though we haven't actually studied, whether or not these emotional responses has made an impact on individuals, behaviors. I think that's just one of those points that may tell us something about why so many of our tribal peoples are struggling with substance use. So that is what I wanted to share with you guys in terms of the different types of impacts that historical trauma has had on tribal peoples. Do you guys have any questions before I pass it over to Marilyn and she can continue on? Okay, Heather's just asking for a copy of the slides and we will definitely share that. All right. If you guys don't have any other questions.
So Selena, the Les Whitbeck research was done with, I think, some Midwestern tribes. So think Iowa, Michigan, Wisconsin, that sort of area. I think it was somewhere between 5 and 7 different communities that Les Whitbeck did, but it's been a while since I've read it, so I'm not sure.
I'll put the reference in the chat. So if you have the ability to look it up, maybe that would
Awesome.
help.
Thanks, Veronica. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go over this slide simply because I think Veronica's done a really great job thinking about what the impacts are on us. And these are some of the impacts on individuals. I think the biggest piece is potentially the psychic numbing and the depression that many of our relatives experience, and also that we struggle with in our mental health and our emotional health. Next slide, please. So, one of the big questions as we're talking about historical trauma responses and historical impacts of historical trauma on our well-being as Native people, how does it get passed down? What's that from? We know what happened. We know that what happened to my great grandma in boarding school with the kinds of abuses and the kinds of neglect that our relatives experience has a direct impact on us emotionally and psychologically today. Thus the Les Whitbeck reference. But how did that happen, right? And part of it is the narratives that we tell as people, with our stories. A lot of our stories for Northern Plains tribes, I'll just talk about Northern Plains tribes and maybe for other tribes too. We have our coup stories, and sometimes we forget that the reason that we're still here is because we're so resilient and we have, we more than survived. We're getting to a place where everything is being revitalized, and we are thriving in our communities today. So sometimes so it's the storytelling, and then the secondary trauma, thinking about as we work with the kids and their families in our communities, the parents and the grandparents, and the kinds of behaviors that people with trauma histories engage in that they have used to survive, right? They've used those behaviors to survive. So think about a client, a student, a patient, a relative who, when something doesn't go their way, they get big and they get angry and they get loud. That's a way that they have learned to protect themselves when their needs aren't being met, when there was danger of not surviving in early childhood adversity. So I always say, and it's a mantra that how to become trauma informed is thinking about and asking, what is the function of the behavior that's happening in front of me with my client, my student, my patient, or my relative? And when I ask that question, it enables me to think, to depersonalize it and step back and not be as impacted by those kinds of behaviors. So it's not necessarily hearing the stories that are so hard to hear, right? Every Monday coming to work with all kinds of stories of what happened over the weekend. That sort of thing can be really hard, but it really mostly we're impacted secondarily with PTSD through the behaviors of the people that we work with. Introjection is the notion that children really feel like they have experienced exactly what their grandparents have experienced or what their parents have experienced. They have identified with that narrative to the detriment of their own well-being. And of course, there's unconscious channels. I don't know if any of you are Jungians or like Carl Jung, but he always believed in a sort of a global consciousness and unconsciousness that we certainly, as human beings, know as human beings, we know certain things about the world, and we don't know why or how we know it, but we pass it on through our energy. And then epigenetics, collective unconscious, thank you. And then there's epigenetics, and the epigenetics is not necessarily, we don't change, what's happened to us doesn't change our genes. It changes how those genes get read, right? So all of the characteristics of my DNA will be there, but I might, but the way that they're read, which is why it might not just be, that we were given flour and lard to survive with food. It might not just be poor food sources. It might also be that we're diabetic because of that weak link around the trauma that we experienced. For instance, many tribes have experienced hunger winters where many tribes died off. Tribal people, entire families and lodges were no longer there in the spring simply because the beef wagons couldn't make it onto the reservation. So it's those kinds of ways that we think about food insecurity and how we as Native people suffer from diabetes when there doesn't seem to be any real reason for it necessarily. It can't be just poor diet. It's too prevalent in our communities. Next slide, please. So again, I just want to very briefly mention the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. What is interesting about this is that they found that people with an ACE score of 4, I'm going to make an assumption that everyone on this call has at least heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And they found that people with ACEs of 4 or more, not actually, or 4 or 7 or more, die 20 years earlier than their contemporaries. So it is impacting our health. And I know that so many times we have, on my reservation, we have a local mortuary that provides death notices and obituaries in the time for the honoring for the family of that person that has died. And I'm always shocked. There's so many people in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s that shouldn't necessarily be passing on, but they are because of poor health. And I really do believe that a lot of that has to do with the impacts of trauma on our well-being. What ACEs didn't look at, though, either is it didn't look at context. It didn't look at social context. It didn't look at thanks, Nancy. It didn't look at if you experienced racism or structural violence. And structural violence is like those institutions that are meant to help us actually contribute to the traumas that we've experienced. And I always like to use Indian Health Service, not dissing Indian Health Service, love them, worked for them for a lot of years. But Indian Health Service has been historically for decades funded at 50% of need. That's an example of structural violence, that when we as Native people, Indigenous people in America cannot access basic health care like our non-tribal member contemporaries. That's structural violence, and it has a huge impact on our health outcomes, and not just our physical health outcomes, but our emotional, psychological, and social outcomes. Next slide, please. So let's think about this. when we're thinking about historical trauma, I want us to, we have to think really broadly. So any of us that are serving or working with tribal communities, we have to really think about contemporary personal histories of trauma. We have to think about family histories of trauma. We have to think about contemporary traumas that are occurring in the community, car wrecks and early death and suicides and domestic violence and those sorts of things that, you know, that a lot of our relatives struggle with. And we have to think about that. And then we have to start looking about intergenerational trauma, and then thinking about all that intergenerational trauma in the context of removal, where we were taken from our nurturing, loving, wholesome families and communities, and where we forgot our wholesome, natural, holistic ways of parenting, and instead parented like our, I want to say captor or our oppressor, as we were parented in quotes in boarding schools. Yes, there is a lack. Thanks, Heather, for bringing that up. There is a lack of access in urban settings also. I mean, yeah, absolutely. There are some urban clinics in urban settings around the United States, but not all of our people that are displaced or know about them or have access to them. I'm thinking of places in Oklahoma or in Oakland, California. How, you know, transportation is always an issue in Indian country, whether it's urban or rural, right? Yeah, really good. Thank you. So in thinking about it, we've lost some of our cultural ways, some of our, I think about my Dakota relatives that probably came over from the Minnesota region over into the Dakotas and then into eastern Montana, and wonder what the medicines were that existed in a heavily wooded lake region, and they came to a prairie river region, and where they found their medicines and healings. Every time I think about this, I think of an elder leader of the Salish Bitterroot Salish people who were being moved from the Bitterroot Valley up onto the Flathead Reservation, and somebody asked this elder what the problem was, because they were being moved from the Bitterroots or the Bitterroot Mountains, and they were being placed in an area where they have the Mission Mountains now. That's what it's called now. And the elder said, our songs that live in the Bitterroot Mountains don't live in those mountains over there. So thinking about place-based healing and access to healing ways and ceremonies and songs, in all of those ways that we culturally and spiritually healed, were removed when we were displaced and removed from our natural original homelands. So that, as you see, there's any current traumas and stressors and how we cope, do you have any to add to this list of how it impacts substance use, dependency, violence, suicide? Are we missing anything? There probably is, but I can't think of anything either. So we're going to go to the next. Depression. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that is one for sure. And anxiety. Okay, next slide, please. This is an ACE study, and you'll be getting these slides. I'm not going to beat the ACE study to death, but the ACE study has been done in Indian country, and here are some of the studies that we have accessed in providing this kind of information to tribal community members. And so please, when you get the slides, please see what you can find. And in fact, no, I don't think we have those, do we? We don't have these articles. We have historical trauma articles. Okay, thank you, Veronica. Next slide, please. So, as you think about the systems that we work in, and that our children and our relatives negotiate every day, schools, IHS, healthcare systems, child welfare systems, justice systems, and how it impacts us is we have to remind ourselves, when I would go back to my tribal council, when I first moved to Missoula and was at the National Native Children's Trauma Center, and I would stand before them, and they would bring up the poor behavior, the really bad behaviors of university researchers. And while I had never done any of that, I had never engaged in any of that kind of bad research, helicoptering in and helicoptering out, or without tribal permission, or all of the protocols that we have to go through when we're working with tribal communities. I had to own that history. And I think so often, if we're not tribal members and we're in a school system on a reservation, or we're child welfare workers, or we're a judge, we have to really acknowledge the historic mistrust by tribal members of the systems that we are serving in. We didn't do that. That's not who we are. We are well-intentioned, safe human beings, but we have to own that, yes, my child welfare system did not do well by your children and your families. There's cumulative trauma. We know that it just is, there's not just this isolated incident, all kinds of different kinds of ways of thinking about trauma and the cumulative effect of it. But I also want to talk about a little bit about positive childhood experiences in a few minutes here. Again, coming to town, I think of all the physicians that I worked with, and the psychologists that I worked with in IHS on my reservation, and they were coming with their pet, therapeutic models, right? They would come and they would say, oh, cognitive behavioral is the way to go in helping people change, right? To get sober, clean and sober, to stop being depressed or having anxiety. They would come with all of these, but they were hardly ever based in any sort of cultural understanding about how we make meaning as tribal people. It was always from a Western perspective. And I think that that's another piece of the puzzle when we're thinking about how historical trauma impacts our well-being. It's changing, definitely changing, but just again, really reminding ourselves that it's not that most of the time. I am a colonized Native person. I have been educated in a Western educational system. I have to own that and have to I have been about the business of decolonizing my mind since I got into adulthood. Again, a lack of cultural knowledge or respect for the local tribe. Very often people that step into helping roles will not see the strength of the community. They begin to identify the community up with the maybe, 7 families that really struggle. I always think of a tribal judge who said to me, I had his grandfather in my court as a teenager, and then I had his dad in my court, and now his grandson is in my court. So we have to remind ourselves that we are a rich, wholesome, loving, caring people, and that what we're about the business of doing is supporting our most vulnerable. So just knowing that, again, systemic racism, we all have experienced that. It does have an impact on our well-being, and the continued colonial practices that the relationship with the federal agencies that we work with, and the state agencies, and the educational systems that continue to engage in colonial ways or Western ways of teaching or training or serving. Next slide, please. So again, trauma-informed, again, is looking at the history, and rather than thinking, what's wrong with you and your people? Why don't you just get over it? We have to ask, what's happened to your people? What's the unique story in this community? What's the unique community story? What's the unique family stories that have impacted the well-being of the families that we serve? And really, and thinking much more about what's happened to them, and unpathologize or depathologize our communities and depathologize our families. So that's a big piece of becoming trauma informed, or thinking about how to integrate understanding of historical trauma in the context of providing services. Next slide, please. Again, and just knowing that what this, it would be great. It's almost, I wish we could get like inoculations or something, like we would have all of this knowledge and all we had to do is get a little in the arm. But what we know about historical trauma and its impacts and how we deal with the people that we work with, and and I don't mean just clients, patients, students, right? But our colleagues, right, have been impacted by historical trauma, by their own personal intergenerational trauma and their personal traumas. And it really is impacting how we provide services, how we engage in relationships that are thoughtful and kind and supportive. So just know that there's more to all of this work, and you can never learn enough about trauma, the impacts of trauma, and historical, intergenerational, and contemporary personal trauma. Next slide, please. So again, how do we think about it? So what you guys are doing now is you've come to this presentation specifically because you're very curious about really what is this historical trauma, but I want to hear another perspective, or I want to think more about how historical trauma has impacted me and my family. So a big piece is realizing that there's widespread impact of trauma and thinking about and understanding potential paths to recovery. So, okay, so we've experienced that. What's our strength? Where do we find healing and support? What's that going to look like? And really realizing that people's behaviors are about their survival. And even though somebody says, it's not helpful that you get big at my front desk with my receptionist and start yelling because it's not going to get you services faster. No, that's not going to be helpful. Telling somebody that isn't going to be helpful because they're triggered, right? And what we also have to realize is our own trauma histories. And the realizing is asking ourselves, what are my trauma triggers, right? One of my trauma triggers is loud screaming and yelling. I don't do well when things start getting loud. I don't do we have the Montana Grizzlies. Oh, yay, football, University of Montana. I don't like going to large football games because of the volume, just because it's such a trigger for me. It's very interesting. Getting to know our triggers will help us manage our own behaviors that will be better to support the kids and the families that we work with. And then really understanding what are some of the signs and behaviors and symptoms of my colleague that might have a trauma history. What is this? What is it about? What are some of the behaviors? What are some of the coping strategies, right? We were talking earlier about the suicide thoughts, ideation, fixation, substance use, and misuse. Those are all strategies to try to manage the feeling of being triggered all the time, of being up here and activated all the time, right? Walking on our toes, surveilling our environments for safety always, not just physical safety, but psychological safety, spiritual safety, right? So it's really recognizing what that looks like for yourself and for the clients that you work with. Again, really integrating what is the knowledge and how am I going to utilize this knowledge the next time I meet with this student, this teacher, this administrator, this relative, this patient, this colleague, right? And what are the strategies that myself as an individual and my agency and within my household, how am I going to resist re-traumatization? What's that going to look like? And part of my journey is to be very thoughtful and mindful And before I go into certain settings, I had to get spiritually and emotionally ready for those situations, and find peace and connection with the spiritual world for myself, and to be able to negotiate in a thoughtful way and not be triggered, or understand that that might trigger me, and understand that's all it is. I don't have to react. I can respond or not respond, right? Okay, next slide, please. Again, this is the part that's the good news. We know that we can heal from our traumas. That's the good news of this issue around trauma, whether it's historical, intergenerational, or personal trauma. We can heal. It's not a death sentence. We can find wellness and support and a community, and we can be that person, that conduit for healing for others too. Again, thinking about the people that we serve, not pathologizing our communities, but really understanding that not everyone is suffering from the consequences of historical and intergenerational trauma, even though they may have experienced, because there's so many factors that contribute to resiliency, so many. And we'll talk about those in a couple minutes. And then but no, it's not going to be easy. And I think that's a big message of becoming trauma-informed, or understanding the impacts of historical trauma on well-being and services, and developing relationships, therapeutic relationships, or nurturing relationships with the people that we work with. It's really just know that it's difficult, and that we have to give grace. We have to give forgiveness. We have to give space for people to find their way in their healing. Next slide, please. So again, we are still here, right? That's the good news. We have maintained optimism. We have a spirituality and a compassion very often, empathy, and humor is one of my best ways of coping. I love to laugh and make people laugh. Friendships and community strengths. I like it, Jerry. Lately, he's been using historical resiliency to focus on the strengths-based approach. Awesome. I like it. Historical resiliency. Next slide, please. So we do know that no matter what, many of us, everybody, my guess is some of the people on this call may have experienced traumatic events in their lifetime, or come from families that had those experiences, or live in a community that has those historical experiences of colonization, that connected to colonization, right? So, but we've bounced back, we've done better. And depending on what has happened to us, is a lot to do with what our supports are, who our safe person was, our own personalities, right? Around being either optimistic or pessimistic. Optimists tend to do a little bit better than pessimists, that sort of thing. So it's when the trauma happened, how old you were, what kind of support you had at the time, that sort of thing. So again, just thinking about when you're resilient, building on that resiliency, or thinking about how you were supported, is a good way of thinking about how to be supportive to others. Next slide, please. So we have to depathologize the historical trauma and talk about our strengths, or as Jerry says, historical resiliency. I love it. Have to have a generational perspective. We are not going to heal our community this week, maybe not even this year, maybe not in my lifetime, but we have to have a generational perspective. My children will do better than I did. My grandchildren will be better equipped than my kids were to face the world and the world's challenges, and to thrive in their chosen settings. So that's a big piece of having that perspective and not losing hope. Shifting the narrative to really look at our strengths and what those strengths were passed down. And then really addressing the differing views. There are those folks in Indian country who don't give any sort of credibility to the term historical trauma, that we all should just sober up and get a job. that's their opinion. That's been their life experience. I honor them as they go their way and I go my way, but I choose to think about context always. I choose to think about place and time and what the spiritual lessons and the cultural teachings of where I am from. So I think that goes a long way in helping me understand and have hope. Next slide, please. Enculturation. So this is a big piece of the conversation, and that I think here's where I'll introduce positive childhood experiences. As we think about helping our relatives, our students, our clients, our patients access cultural and spiritual teachings of their tribes, of our tribal communities, and how that really builds resiliency for American Indian children and families. And that it should be a big part of the conversation when providing services. I personally want all of us to get to the place where we are honoring of all spiritual traditions in our communities, that none of us will ever look down or think another way of believing or praying or engaging in ceremony is wrong, but that we all have our way and our path, and it's okay. But for adolescents and American Indian adolescents, it's a huge piece of the conversation about healing or feeling connected, because positive childhood experiences is really a study that asks seven questions of individuals. And the question was, say yes or no to these questions. Before the age of 18, I was able to talk with the family about my feelings. Yes or no? Before the age of 18, I felt that my family stood by me during difficult times. Yes or no? Before I was 18, I enjoyed participating in community traditions. Before I was 18, I felt a sense of belonging in high school. Before the age of 18, I felt supported by my friends. Before the age of 18, I had at least one or at least two non-parent adults who took a genuine interest in me. Before the age of 18, I felt safe and protected by an adult in my home. So that sense of belonging to a school, of participating in community traditions, of having two non-parent adults, right? That's where we come in as the folks that are there to support the kids and families and the community members, right? We are the natural helpers. We are professional helpers and natural helpers. And the small bits of things that we do to support one another go a long way in really offsetting adverse childhood experiences and really building the resilience of the kids that we work with. So never think that it's just a volleyball game. Never think, well, it's just where some of them are sitting around making drums, or it's just a culture camp for the summer and just give them something to do. No, you're building resiliency. You're giving opportunity for connection for those kids and their families to be able to feel like they belong somewhere and they belong to a community or to a people. I know in high school, there was always the guys that would struggle academically until basketball season, right? And then people would say, oh, it's because they want to play basketball. That's why they're finally studying. I don't believe that's true. I believe that when basketball season came along, they felt like they belonged somewhere. They felt like they were contributing to a team, a family, right? They felt like they had a sense of purpose. So all of that is connected in building resilience for our kids. And so I think that's a big piece. Oh, go ahead, please. Heather, I'm blah, 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 blah. Ask a question. Yes, I can share the questions. Yes, absolutely. Next slide, please. So we're going to end with this, with meeting Jade for everything that we've learned. You're working as a probation officer. Jade is a tribal member and she's late for her check-in with you. When she finally shows up, she's upset. She voices that you aren't helping her like you should and that you don't care about her. She doesn't get what the point is for showing up, and she storms out of your office. What might be contributing to her anger? Anybody? What might be contributing to Jade's anger? Did you trigger her? Did the receptionist trigger her? Did mom in the car before she got out of the car to come in to meet her probation officer trigger her? Was grandma lecturing her? Her own insecurities? You mean she's afraid because she was late and she might be in trouble? Because that's how I think of it. Because when I hear someone being called insecure, it feels like we're saying they have some sort of character flaw, and they don't, right? She may have experienced a trauma around being late, right? Now you can't have that treatment. Now you can't go to that game. Okay, thank you. I figured that's what you meant, Jen. Is it Jen? I hope. Jenny. So just thinking about what that is, because it's really, honestly, it's not a Jenny. Okay, Janae. We'll get it. I apologize. Yep, there's another problem that's upsetting her. Thanks, Carolyn. She probably has a lot on her shoulders at home. Absolutely. I mean, after all, she's had negative contact with law enforcement. She's gone through adjudication, right? She's having to see you and check in with a probation officer. There's a lot going on in Jade's life. A lot of things that we might not even be aware of, right? She might not be doing well in school. She might have had a fight with the boyfriend. She might have broken up with the boyfriend. Dad might be drinking again. Mom isn't supportive. Sisters are being bullies at home. All kinds of different things that could be happening in her life that may be impacting how she shows up at your door. And so that's really the hallmark, or the how to become trauma informed isn't in 5 easy steps or the 4 R's, as we discussed earlier on the slide. It really is about thinking about, how do we develop a relationship with this adolescent, this patient, this student, this client, this relative, this colleague? How do we develop a loving, trusting relationship so that we can speak life into them, and we can speak life into them being able to change and to heal? Feeling overwhelmed, yep, it gets easy to blame somebody else because you feel helpless, right? That's one of the big things. Being triggered, you feel helpless and hopeless, and that gets you in all kinds of activated feelings. Accountability I think is around fear. I really do feel like people are afraid of accountability because of past experiences, right? And or they've never walked in mastery of anything. So we're talking about basketball, right? So the young men and women I'm old, way back in the day, as they say, they were good ball players. They knew they were good. They had mastered the game. They could dribble, they could shoot, they could guard, they could post up, they could do everything that they needed to do. They had mastery in it. And a lot of times some of the kids we're seeing are not in spaces or places. They've never been successful in school. They're not successful as a family member or as a trusted relative, that sort of thing. Yeah, and they're distrustful of authority figures because authority figures have never been helpful or caring. All right. What might be a way to repair that kind of interaction with Jade?
Have to get on a Learjet to get over there in time. That's a bummer not being there with you going through this shit, but you know I'm not big.
I think that we can go the extra mile, a phone call, a text. Oh gosh, yes, that generation, a text. You know, reschedule. Yeah, come on in anytime or come back. I'm here. Yep, listen more than you speak. Yep. Yep, have a seat. So one thing that we do know, here's a little, yeah, what's helpful to you? What has helped you in the past? What's made you feel better in the past, Jade?
Are you still just taking 2 a day, Kitty?
Thanks, Jerry. So here's for if you are probation officers or you have adolescents.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Get those fireballs, those jawbreaker fireballs, because and then have things for them to grab and touch and manipulate with their hands. Play-Doh, strings, pipe cleaners, lower the lights, fireballs, soft music, some sort of music that there is not natural to them. So they're not triggered by songs. I don't know about you guys, but I listen to classical music simply because it's music that was never a part of my life until I came until I grew up, because because I just got tired of being triggered all the time by the songs that I listen to. Snacks, safe place to vent. Yep. Appropriate with the right person. Yep. Absolutely. All of those are correct. Next slide, please. So again, depersonalizing what that behavior is, using your historical trauma lens. If you are not, oh, good. Me too, Eva. Learn if you're not from that tribe, even if you're a tribal member and not from that tribe, learn the local tribal history and what the strengths are and what some of their survival stories are, because can be very exciting and things that we should be very proud of. Work to provide corrective experiences or positive experiences. I think I'm going to change that in the slide to positive childhood experiences, and not just childhood experiences, but thinking about how people find healing. I think about people that start to do ceremony in adulthood as they're longing to be clean and sober. And some of them go to a Pentecostal church and that's where they find a way to stay clean and sober. And both of those places are about spirituality, but it's also a place where they belong, where they're accepted, where they can come to a place and not find judgment. They can find healing. Really understanding and knowing that you can't do it all, that you need the community and you need other providers and other professionals and spiritual leaders and for yourself, and be sensitive to the differences of how people identify with their culture. Some, like I just gave the example, there are some people who may not be comfortable entering into tribal spiritual ways because they have a legacy, their family has a legacy of being fundamentalist Christians, and that's okay. That we can honor that. So just be sensitive to that too. Not just offering one way to find healing, and then be curious. If you're not a tribal member, be curious about the cultural dynamics in the relationships that community members have with each other, and look for on purpose the strengths. Next slide, please. We did it. We are out of time, but Veronica and I will stay on a few minutes if you all are willing to stay on, or if you want to, please feel free to leave. Thank you all so much for coming on and participating. I want to shout out to the Fort Peck tribal folks. I see you, Carolyn. I see you, Madonna. Who else do I see? I'm going down the list.
Hello, everyone. Please also take the end of session evaluation. It is up on the screen now. This really helps us with future online learning events, and your feedback is greatly appreciated.
We appreciate, yes, we do, because we take to heart and try to improve our presentations and materials. Anybody have any comments, stories, or questions they want to share as you finish your session? Yep, it is. You should have let me see you too, Madonna. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, if nobody has any stories or comments, we're gonna jump off. Oh, Nancy Goodman. Cool. The slideshow question, Antonia, that's a question for you. Can the slides be emailed?
Yes, all of the materials from today and the session video will be sent to you in a follow-up email.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.